What's up, guys? Welcome back to Richter's Creative Design. My name's Brandon Richter, and today we're going to build these rustic cornhole boards. Alright, we're going to get started by rough cutting all the pieces that we need out of 4 2x4s. I'm going to set my stop block to 48.5 inches and cut one piece out of each one of the 2x4s. Reset it to 24.5 inches and cut one out of each 2x4. And then reset it to 14 inches and cut the last piece out of each 2x4. Once we have all the pieces rough cut, we will move over to the joiner. I know the guard's missing on this joiner. It likes to stick on me a little bit. I don't advocate removing any safety feature on a tool, but I am very careful in my hand placement on this. I'm just trying to get one flat face and square up one edge on each one of these pieces. That way when we move over here to the planer, we can run them all through the planer and get parallel faces on each one of the pieces. I'm not trying to take a whole lot of material off of these. I'm just trying to kind of get rid of the factory rounded corners and just get everything nice and square. Then we'll move over to the table saw. I'm gonna rip every one of them down to about 3 3/8. This gives us some good square edges now, so that now when we get ready to put these things together, we're working with some good square stuff. All right, now that we got everything milled up nice and square, we can move back to the miter saw. We're going to set the miter saw at 45 degrees and we're going to line our stock up with that zero clearance insert and make our first cut. Once we have our first cut made, nice and pretty, we can measure out the distance that we need. We'll make a little mark and we'll carry that mark to the opposite top from what we referenced to make our first cut. We'll lay that angle out on that opposite top, and then we can use that mark to line up to the blade on the miter saw, get it lined up and set our stop block. Once our stop block's set, we can go ahead and make our second cut, and now everything's set up to where everything's nice and repeatable. Make our first cut, flip the board over, butt it up to our stop block, and we can make our second cut. And then the only thing that we'll need to change is after we cut our 4 pieces at this length is repeat the steps to set up for our second length and get all 4 of those cut. Miters are cut. We're going to move to the table saw now. I'm going to set the blade height to the same thickness as the plywood for the tops. I'm going to set the fence to the same measurement. What we're going to do with this is I'm going to cut a rabbet out of the top inside corner of each one of these pieces. That'll give us a nice little recess for the plywood tops to sit down inside these frames so you don't see the plywood edges. Test cut's done, everything fit nice and flush, so we can move on to cutting the rabbets in each one of the other pieces. You can kind of see now the way the rabbet's going to lay out on the inside edges of these. So once we get all the rabbets cut, we will then drill some pocket holes. That way we don't have to use any brad nails or anything from the top that you could see. Setup for this Craig jig was a little bit tricky, seeing as you had to take into account the thickness of that rabbet, and being that the plywood wasn't quite half an inch. Best results for me came setting the jig at 7/8 of an inch, but then setting the stop collar and the bit up for 1/2 inch material. That seemed to work out pretty good and got the holes to line up where I needed them to be for these. I chose to use my domino and cut some loose tenon mortises for the joinery on these. I know there's other ways you can join up miter joints, and if you'd like me to do a full video on some other options, I can. Also, let me know in the comments if you'd like a full setup video on how to use this domino. I know it can be pretty tricky, especially somebody who's new to a domino. So now that our joinery's cut, we can go ahead and test it, fit these things up, make sure everything's gonna fit nice before we actually glue these things up. I'll go ahead and take this time to double check all my measurements for my tops, make sure that when I cut those are gonna fit good, make sure everything's good and square, and we'll take a look at those joints. I do like the way these things came together, so now we can move on to making our plywood tops. I'm gonna lay this out. Unfortunately, I don't have a track saw, you know, future goals and all, but since I don't, I'll just go ahead and use a straight edge, lay my measurements out, and rough cut them with the circular saw here before I move on to the table saw. If you noticed, I use a little bit of blue painter's tape just to help keep any tear out from happening. And now we'll do the same thing over on the table saw. I'll lay it out, use some painter's tape, and I'll cut them down to our final dimension on the table saw. All right, so now we got all our tops cut. We're gonna go ahead and set them in here and test fit, make sure that they fit good and tight. Make sure I like it, and looks like I do. So now let's go ahead and break these things down and start getting ready to actually glue these things up. I went ahead and labeled all of the pieces so that I knew exactly which way they went back together, so that now when we start gluing up, I can match everything back up where it needs to be. So we'll go ahead and dump a little bit of glue in each one of these mortises here. Don't be stingy with the glue at this point. I'd rather spend a little extra time cleaning up glue squeeze out than end up having a joint come apart over time that didn't have enough glue. So now we got some glue, got everything together. We're gonna go ahead and add the band clamp back on and get it tightened down good. Once we get it on, I did need to use a couple of pipe clamps just to kind of pull everything together good and tight and make sure all these joints fit good. So now that the frames are drying out of the clamps, I'm going to cut the hole. This will be a 6-inch hole. Center of it will be 9 inches from the top and 12 inches from the sides. I made this little jig on the CNC machine. If you don't have a CNC machine, you can set up a little circle jig on a router to cut this out, or you can just buy a 6-inch hole saw. Either way will work. So now the tops are attached, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to laying out the legs. I went ahead and ripped these down to 2 3/4 on the table saw, and I did cheat and cut this template with the CNC machine. I will have with the plans the actual layout for this, but from the end of the board to the end of the leg, it is 12 3/8 inches, and that angle is 65 degrees if you want to just lay it out yourself. We're gonna go ahead to the miter saw and set that angle at 65 degrees and line it up and cut all those angles. I did go ahead and set a stop up to where I could just set them all up and keep cutting them off. Once we get it cut here, then we'll move on to the bandsaw and rough cut those radiuses out on the ends. Once all the radiuses are done, cut on the ends there, we'll move on to the belt sander and we'll go ahead and just kind of sand them all up and clean all those bandsaw marks off. Now we'll take them to the drill press, and with that nice little center punch hole, I can line it up with a Forstner bit. That's a 3/8 Forstner bit, and we'll go ahead and get all of these drilled out and get them ready to attach. So to be able to line up where to drill the holes in the boards for the legs, I just made this jig real quick. That way I can just clamp it on either side and have an accurate hole placement for all of these holes for the legs. So now that we've got that done, we can move on to getting these things sanded up and get ready for finish. So let's get these things sanded up real quick, and then I'll show you what we're going to do with the finish. Alright, so as you see here, I went ahead and took the tops out, and we're going to go ahead and burn these tops just a little bit. I'm not going to go too crazy with them, I'm just trying to give them a little bit of color. On the frames themselves, I'm actually going to stain them a pretty dark stain, so I think it'll give it a nice little rustic look and give it some nice contrast. So I don't typically like to burn these things inside the shop, but it was dark, you couldn't see it with filming. But I do have a fire extinguisher ready, and I'm being extremely careful, so don't try this at home, kids. All right, now that we got some color on these things, we're gonna get ready for the graphics. I'm gonna paint the graphics on, so I've got some vinyl stencils I made to lay the graphics out and get ready to paint. I didn't get any footage of actually laying these out and cutting these on the vinyl cutter. If this is something you want to see, I can do a full series on how to design these things for the vinyl cutter and how to cut stencils with the vinyl cutter. So if that's something you want to see, hit me up in the comments and we'll look at adding that as a future video. But right now I'm just getting the stencils laid on here, and then we'll get them masked up and get them ready for a little bit of paint. Quick note on these graphics though, this is one that I did not design myself. I did find these from a shop on Etsy, and I'll try to link to that Etsy shop where I found these. Sometimes it just saves a little bit of time having somebody else that's already done this work. Just go ahead and buy it from them. But if it's something you want to create yourself, hey, spend the time and create it yourself. But this one saved me a little bit of time. All right, we got some graphics painted on the tops. While we're letting that dry, we're gonna move on to throwing some stain on these frames. I'm just using some Minwax Jocko Bean. I really like this color. It's a nice, dark, rich color. I use it on a lot of stuff, so I highly recommend it if you like that dark stained color. So we'll get these things stained up and we'll move on from there. So now the fun of removing all the stencils and removing all this masking. I really like this part because this is where this starts to really come together and really start seeing what these graphics are going to look like. So I think these things turned out pretty good. So we'll get the rest of this stuff off and then we'll start getting the final assembly done. So here it is. We're going to start gluing these tops on. I'm gonna throw a little glue around here and throw these tops in, get them flipped over, and start throwing some screws in these dudes. And once we get this one finished, it'll just be the same thing for the other side. Once I get these all together, I'm gonna add about 3 or 4 coats of just some wipe-on poly on these. Spoiler alert, I don't have my footage for that, so I didn't get to show it to you. But we'll move on and attach the legs after we get done putting these tops on here, and then we'll be just about done. Alright, we got these things assembled up. They look great. We're going to go ahead and attach the legs. I've got some 4-inch carriage bolts that I just painted the heads black on there. Figured to make it look a little bit better with these dark rustic colors. Going to add a fender washer, and we're going to take the leg. Make sure we get the angle right to where when it sits up, it's going to sit flat on the ground. And we throw that leg on there, throw a regular flat washer and a lock washer, and we're going to tighten these things down. I'm going to go ahead and tighten it down good and snug and get that carriage bolt sucked up good and tight in there. And then once I get it sucked up good and tight, then I'll just kind of loosen the nut up just a little bit just to adjust it and to where it's just a nice little friction fit on that leg. We'll repeat the same steps for the other leg and get that one attached, and then we'll move on and do the same thing for the other board. So that's it. We got them wrapped up. I think these things turned out great. So we're actually getting ready to go to a little family function. These are actually going out to my brother-in-law from his wife. So you're welcome, Taylor. We're going to try them out. Guys, if you like this, make sure you like and subscribe. I've got a lot more content planned, and I got a lot more videos to put out.